So that brings us to the question, how do we as scholars, or um, to be honest, how do you all as undergraduate students, I like to use the term um, apprentice scholars, how do you all enter this interminable conversation that's been going on about an issue you've identified? That can be one of the most daunting things that we as undergraduates are asked to do. We're asked to enter into this conversation with experts who've been engaged in this conversation for their entire careers for 40 years. So how does this social understanding help us um, find ways to enter the conversation? Well, we know that academic intellectual inquiry kind of starts with it's a process of understanding conflicts, understanding the claims that others make, and developing important questions to ask. Which is something we practiced in week 2. But to be more basic, it means that we need to think of writing one of the first steps as doing research, right? We need to understand the conversation and the conflicts that have come before. The conflict is necessarily going to be an area in which we can put in our oar, as Kenneth Burke says, and we need to know who has said what. To go back to that Kenneth Burke metaphor, you can't just kick down the parlor door. There are folks in there who have been having a conversation about gravity or why things fall downward for millennia. You can't simply kick the door down with your fingers in your ears, not having heard anything that people say, and say, here's what I think gravity is, here's what I think about gravity. You have to understand, you have to show that you understand the conversation that's gone before. That's how you earn, especially as undergraduates, as people who don't have a lot of ethos, a lot of authority on their topic yet. If you don't have a PhD in astrophysics, how do you enter the conversation? Well, you really need to show that you know what Galileo said, and then what Newton said, and find most recently what Einstein and Stephen Hawking have said. One of the biggest ways to damage your ethos is to show that you don't fully understand the conversation that's come before, right? So just for an instance, of course, since this is conversational, since texts and arguments are people talking, they're not talking in a vacuum, right? We know that they're happening in this rhetorical situation. These arguments were made by a writer for an audience about a subject. As such, they have different purposes, exigencies, genres. We won't worry about those latter three much yet. But my point was, if you are trying to make a point to modern astrophysicists about gravity, and you're citing the theory that Aristotle put forward, that's going to signal to everyone that you as a writer don't have a lot of ethos. If you were a writer and your subject was the history of gravity, and you were writing to people who were interested in how we used to think gravity works, that paper would be very interesting. If you are writing to understand a modern conceptual idea about gravity, and you're citing Aristotle, and you don't actually know that your audience is modern scholars, and you don't actually know that somehow you don't know what Newton said about gravity, right? Your argument and your ethos in that argument will be irreparably damaged. To be as frank as I can, we need to, especially as undergraduates who can't rest on our laurels, we really need to show that we know and understand and can place our own argument within the really good arguments that have been made before, or the bad arguments that have been made before, right? We might want to identify something we disagree with and really handle that responsibly. That's going to earn us a lot of ethos or credibility on the issue. It's similar to, if you've probably seen someone on the internet, I think in fact there's a subreddit called Ate the Onion, where people take a headline from The Onion, which is a satirical news source, and they get outraged by it, right? Because they don't understand that it's a joke. And that sort of ruins their argument, right? Because it shows that they haven't really done their homework. Great. I think really the takeaway from this slide is, how do we enter the conversation? Before we say anything, right, we need to sort of catch the tenor of the argument, learn to identify conflicts, and know their history, know what the key points that have been said about them are. It's really important to explicitly identify an issue and identify the situation that calls for some response in writing. Modern academic writers do this all the time. In fact, if you think of any academic paper that you've read recently, we often have an introduction or review of literature that starts with what other people have said. We usually get a history of the idea, whatever it is, whether it's literary, biological. We get this brief history of who thought what and an explicit moment in which the writer says, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here is why my argument matters. So that's a really important step that we will practice when we get to the creating a research space format. We'll practice really explicitly saying, here's what's been said before, here's what's unsettled, and that's why my thesis matters. And we just need to keep in mind, meaning the fact that these arguments are conversational also means that they are rhetorical, that these are arguments that take place between a writer who has a purpose, who has an audience, and who has a subject, right? So just keep in mind that every piece you find as you set out to collect research to understand the conversation that's gone before, we shouldn't be evaluating all of those sources. Not all sources are created equal. When we're reading a paper about quantum physics, we want to pay attention to who wrote it and for whom, and we want to ask when, right? Because we want to evaluate and make sure we have a quality source. Just because it was published in 1940 doesn't mean that it still has currency. So we want to be rhetorically aware of the sources that we come across, because they're not all created the same. There are these past voices in the conversation, some of which are still relevant, some of which aren't. So keep those things in mind. Just because we want to pay attention not just to when it was published, who published it. Does that publisher have ethos, or is it just Joe Smith in his mom's basement on his blog, right? What kind of ethos does this writer have? Who is the audience? If it's a piece about gravity, but it's pretty clear that the audience is kindergartners and it's a picture book, right? That is not maybe a voice in the conversation that you want to bring in to your own review of literature. You don't want to be caught allied with a children's writer in this context. So this is all to just say, pay attention when you do the research to who created these sources, for what purpose, for what audience, and when, right? These are important questions as we evaluate our sources in the annotated bibliography in week 3. What does all of this mean for research? Well, Green says that research can be seen as collecting information for its own sake. Of course it can be. And I don't think necessarily the strike through doesn't suggest that that's not what research is. But given what we know about this inquiry process as a social one, we might want to reframe research as the intentional discovery and purposeful use of information. In other words, we know that we're doing research ultimately to put in our own ore. So as you do research, some things that will help you evaluate sources are not just not just those rhetorical questions we just talked about, but also you should be asking yourself, how can I use this source? Is it relevant? Is it very relevant to the issue or conflict that's driving my conversation, my argument to come into being? Do I agree with it? Will I bring this in as supporting evidence, or do I disagree with it? Will I bring this in and disagree, and this will be that disagreement will be my contribution to the conversation, right? So we don't need to read that at the moment. Just think of this research in this way. Research is not passive. We're not just grabbing the first three sources that we come across. Instead, we are purposefully discovering and using information in a way that will allow us to ultimately contribute in a meaningful way to the conversation that's come before. Okay, I think we've exhausted the topic of research questions. So, as always, feel free to email me. Better yet, to use the Ask Questions Here discussion board post about any questions. And I think this was a really, again, all I'm doing here is sort of recapping what you all did in your discussion boards. So really nice work in this argument as conversation discussion board.